Good afternoon, fans and haters. I am here today, myself being Michael Rechtenwald, NYU's deplorable prof, with Rachel Fulton Brown, an associate professor of history at the University of Chicago. She's been a student of medieval devotion to the Virgin Mary for over 30 years. She is the author of From Judgment to Passion, Devotion to Christ and the Virgin Mary, 800 to 1200, and also Mary and the Art of Prayer, the Hours of the Virgin in medieval Christian Life and Thought, both from Columbia University Press. Professor Brown is also a fencer, and I hope she doesn't use too many of those skills on me today. But she's also we have collided, or rather, we have converged. I don't want to use the word intersected, God forbid, at a very interesting place. Myself coming from studies in secularism, and which obviously has a lot to do with religion, but Rachel coming from, if she doesn't mind, I call her Rachel.
That's good.
Work in religious studies, and yet we're both on the same side of this rather curious divide about campus speech, campus policies, social justice, ideology, PC authoritarianism, whatever you want to call it. So please welcome Rachel to the show. I'm glad to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
It's my pleasure. I want to start off by talking about the piece you wrote that suggested the reasons why the academic left, and its students have such fear of Milo Yiannopolous, and then the piece, the response to the piece, the packet for Rachel, that was just 7 colleagues or 7 other academics who lined up, in effect, I know maybe this isn't pleasant to hear, largely in a disagreement with you. But why don't you start telling us about that piece, the reason why Milo Yiannopolous inspires such dread and loathing in the left?
Okay, well, I actually said why he scares faculty and students, and I didn't necessarily define it as the left specifically.
Okay.
I think what we saw with his campus tour this past 6 months is that he scared pretty much everybody for different reasons. He scared conservatives sufficiently that they canceled him speaking at CPAC soon after that the piece that I published. And what I was reflecting on in the Sightings article, the one that you're asking about, was what his campus tour showed us over the course of the 6 months, the kind of responses that people had to it. I actually started following his tour back in September 2016 when the University of Chicago, which is where I teach, sent out a letter to its incoming freshmen from our dean of students and our college dean saying, if you come to the University of Chicago, don't expect to find safe spaces and trigger warnings in your readings. Come here expecting to be challenged. And when the dean sent out that letter, there was a pretty strong response from some of my colleagues saying, no, we disagree with the administration. And I wanted to go and find out what was triggering that letter and then all of the responses. And so I started watching Milo's talks from the previous spring, and in fact came in just at the time when he was starting up his new set of lectures. And of course, as I wrote a blog post about that early on called Safe Spaces versus Sacred Spaces.
Right.
Saying, as a medievalist, I don't like the idea that someone can be condemned for heresy without a proper inquisition.
Yeah, right.
So I went and I watched Milo's talks, and of course, what I found was something rather different from what people had been saying over the summer about him. I mean, mostly what people had heard was he was a misogynist, he's a racist, he's a xenophobe, he's homophobic, even though he's gay.
Yeah,
which was and what I found was someone who was speaking out of a fairly strongly conservative position, but more specifically a fairly strongly Catholic conservative position, and the things that he was creating most anxiety about when he was talking were quite often issues of Catholics, moral teaching. For example, the reason he ends up being called a misogynist is because he has strong things to say about birth control or abortion.
Right.
He's called homophobic because he has strong things to say about whether or not he thinks homosexual lifestyle is a good choice or not.
Right.
And that what I realized the more, and then I kept following his lectures for the rest of the tour, culminating in the talk at Berkeley, which never happened because there was the Great Riot, with protesters, whether they're students or not, and the administration has insisted those people weren't students, but people throwing barriers through windows and so forth,
setting
so that
cars
Milo
on
wasn't
fire.
able to talk. And it was over the course of that 6 months, I was also blogging about Milo and giving my impression of why he was so triggering and troublesome, and what I actually saw him talking about. And the editor at Sightings got wind of my blogging, and when the riots at Berkeley shut down Milo's, what was meant to be his finale, the editor from Sightings asked me to write a piece about, well, what did I think had been going on? And what I said was, Milo was really, above all, presenting a religious challenge to the students in the faculty, that he was talking about things in a provocative, jokey, meme-filled, performative way that are actually deeply moral questions. I mean, he's worried about the relations between men and women, and that gets him into the transgender debate as well as the marriage and abortion discussion. He's talking about, as I see it, deep questions about what it means to be a community, and that involves ecclesiology as well as immigration questions, and I think, sort of ultimately for me, he's also talking about some of the things that we in the academy have given up talking about, for example, beauty. And a good deal of his performances are also trying to say there should be beauty, there should be fun, there should be sort of laughter in our engagement with questions of truth. And in the Sightings piece, that's what I tried to say in a sort of calm academic way, but linked in the piece to one of the blog posts that I did, the post that I did the day that was supposed to be the Berkeley talk, which I entitled "Why I Love Milo."
Yeah.
I don't think my colleagues like that title very much.
I can't imagine they would. Yeah.
And knowing that going out in Sightings would actually catch the academic audience in a way that my blogging hadn't, I wasn't completely surprised at the response that it got. In fact, I really wasn't.
Yeah.
But it was very interesting seeing what the people who wrote to Sightings and wanted to publish something said in that packet.
Yeah, it's a packet for Rachel Fulton Brown, in which the editor lines up, I think it's 7 responses, 2 from PhD students who are the most sanctimonious of all, of course, and then and virtue signaling beyond belief. I couldn't get through all 7 because I was too nauseated, I have to be honest.
Oh, I read them all carefully, I can tell you.
I'm sure
something.
You did. I've kept away from some of the criticism that has been written about me just because I don't want to see it. But it's tough. But I don't really understand the kernel, and some of the arguments seem to really misrepresent your argument. They seem to be erecting a straw man or woman, and suggestive of merely some idea that you had violated some tenets, basically, some unassailable truth, some very sacrosanct tenets of the Church of the academic world. So I want to get into this question about religion because I have argued that indeed a social justice ideology is a religious movement at base. It is not strictly political by any means. And you have said the same thing, coming from a different angle, and I just sort of want to get your ideas about why that is, how it's religious, and what is it competing for in the public sphere or in the academic sphere in particular?
I agree utterly, and that's very much the gist of what I said in the Sightings piece that got my colleagues particularly upset. That I said, well, the Academy has, as an institution, deeply Christian roots, and this is the medieval universities were the queen of the sciences in the medieval universities was theology, and the training was, it's not exclusively theological, but the sort of principal practice was arguing theological propositions. Obviously with the Reformation, things change, universities change, but with the colleges and universities that are founded by the colonists in the American colonies that become the United States, many of those are of course founded also as seminaries. Right. Harvard and Yale and Princeton all had deeply Protestant religious roots as institutions, and I suggested it in the Sightings piece. Well, we used to argue these difficult questions, and now we don't so much anymore. And the university should be a place where we practice those. Yes. Thanks to the responses that I've gotten to the piece, I've kind of changed my mind on that.
Okay, how so?
Well, so I think and this is, I got some pushback from some of my colleagues, both in the packet of responses and indirectly, saying, I don't know the history of universities. Of course, they weren't only ever theological. And I said, well, yes, of course, they had other elements to them. I think where I made a mistake was thinking about the degree to which an institution like the university is able to tolerate heterodoxy. Yes. And indeed, of course, I think the medieval universities did better. I think in the 13th century there was a great effort to try to make sense of, for example, Aristotle's scientific teachings as well as his moral philosophy, with the recognition that he wasn't Christian and that needed wrestling with.
I can't speak to that, but I can go back to the great English institutions of Cambridge and Oxford, of course, and the fact that well into the 19th century, one had to basically swear to the 39 Articles of Faith. Right. I mean, it was a state religion that was you could not enter or graduate without swearing the oath to the 39 Articles. So it seems to me an unassailable point that the university's fundamental basis is religious in character. I don't know how anyone could possibly differ with that unless they're just being dishonest.
I agree, and so the thing is, what I think you and I definitely agree about is it's still religious.
Yes, it is. It's just a different faith. It's a different sect.
The faith has changed.
Yes, the creed is now different. Yes. So let's talk about that creed a bit if we can. Okay. Because I think this is what kind of the burning questions, and I want to see how. One of the things I've tried to suggest is that the university needs to be resecularized in the sense of a higher order, post-secular arbitration needs to be put in place. And because, I don't want to come off as a strict secularist who's trying to drive religion from the face of the earth, because as we know, it'll never happen, and every attempt to do so has failed miserably from the standpoint of the secularizers. And in fact, religion just comes back stronger, it seems, when this is attempted, as in Russia, for example, after the Soviet Union. So what is your sense of what is the creed? You mentioned, you have an article and you talk about the three main tenets or prongs of this liberal left academic creed that's running the universities. Can you elaborate?
Yes, well, many of the blog pieces were written with the hope and the reality that Milo would share them on his Facebook page. So the Facebook has been quite interesting. My blog style has always been a little provocative and jokey, and writing for Milo's audience made it even more so. So that. That's because I mean, one of the things I think we in the Academy need to practice better is reaching out to our educated populace that's not necessarily in the academic argument, but actually cares deeply about these questions. So that's to preface. That piece that you're referring to is in a set of pieces I called Lies of the Left. Yes. And that one's Lies of the Left, Unholy Trinity. And the point was to show the way in which certain claims that we make that seem simply secular in academic arguments right now are grounded in theological structures that are actually Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And the unholy trinity that I pointed to there was multiculturalism, the idea of hate speech,
Mm-hmm.
and identity politics.
Mm-hmm.
And each of those, as I read them as a medievalist and as a student of Christian theology, have deep roots in actual Christian structures. Multiculturalism is actually a heresy of the claim at Pentecost that God comes and speaks in all languages to all people, and you realize that's
the Pentecost is a multicultural phenomenon in effect.
It is. It's a multicultural, and the reason that multiculturalism is a heresy rather than a sort of orthodoxy is it takes the reason for that diversity out of the equation. It's saying in multiculturalism you have diversity simply for the sake of diversity. Speaking in all languages, all are equal. But Pentecost claims that is because it's all in order for everyone to understand the glory of God.
Yeah, so it's not simply about collecting a bunch of diverse people and putting them in the same room without any content. The point is to communicate the same truth to all those different groups.
Right, and my sense is multiculturalism has no core. It becomes idolatrous of itself if diversity becomes the point, as opposed to the method.
Right. It's also its epistemology and its foundational philosophy, if it has one. I think it's a rotted core, but is basically utter relativism. I mean, there's no distinction between one culture and another. We can't evaluate cultures. One culture is as good as the other culture. If one group practices, genital mutilation of women, that's their culture. That's their culture.
But that's it's a heresy that developed out of the good idea.
Yeah.
That particularly the missionaries in the 19th and 20th centuries carried to all of these other parts of the world, that all peoples are to be preached to and witnessed to in their own language, and with the Christianity is actually as a missionizing faith has been typically quite open to other cultural influences. So.
Okay. Plus, it's open to other cultures because it has an evangelical credo, right? I mean,
right. And so multiculturalism is in fact a Christian claim, but without the focus on God, right?
Right.
When
you say it's a heresy, I just want to clarify something real quickly now.
Okay.
It is a heresy in the technical sense that it's a deviation that is a corruption of the original. Okay. Right.
Right.
You're not really holding on to this as a heresy from a standpoint of religious evaluation as such.
If you were making an argument from within Christianity, yes.
Yeah, you would be. Okay.
Right? And so the thing is, you and I are heretics right now.
Of course we are. That's why we're talking.
Because we have made a choice against a prevailing conversation, right? So to some extent, it's to just mark it and say, it has a particular relationship to this original claim and is deviant from it. The second of my three was hate speech, and this idea that speech itself can be harmful. And Milo has talked a lot about this. And of course, one of the things with his jokes and his mainly his jokes is to point out, if I make this joke, it doesn't hurt anybody, right? The speech of itself is not harmful. It's not a club.
Right.
And
it's not I said was, it's not a material act as such, right? There's a
it's not an actual physical act. And what Milo will say constantly is, look, I've just said this word that you've been taught to think of as harmful, and nobody died, right?
Exactly.
Nothing. There's no pain in just hearing that word, except in your understanding.
So your sense of this word efficacy, if you will, language efficacy, comes from another Christian core doctrine or value or phenomenon.
Yes, the incarnation of the word.
Right.
So the idea of hate speech is a perversion of this claim in Christian theology that the word became flesh and in fact acted. right? And then philosophically, J.L. Austin in the mid 20th century came up with this idea of speech acts.
Yes.
Words that actually affect things in the world, and that is, as I understand it, among other people, Judith Butler has carried on with this, and she's, of course, it's interesting. She's at Berkeley where they had those riots.
Right.
That speech of itself can be harmful. That she's sort of developed Austin's idea that there's an act in speech to the point where there is such a thing as hurtful speech that is therefore dangerous in a particular way. But if you realize that the only way we even can have that concept of speech being hurtful is again grounded in a particular theological structure which says the Word became flesh.
The Word became flesh, or in the beginning was the Word,
right?
Which is the very origin of all being, right? So,
right. So we are primed to believe that kind of claim, even when people aren't Christian anymore. But within our culture, there's a sort of, it makes sense to make that kind of claim.
Okay, yeah, you trace it to that. That's very interesting because I'm working on a genealogy of some of these things, particularly this notion that language is somehow harmful, that it's sort of performative and actually produces something, And I've often argued that the only language I'm familiar with that actually enacts anything particularly is computer code, because it actually produces the referent that it's refer the referent that it refers to. But what I wanted to ask you about this is, my sense of it is also there's some connection to, deconstruction and post-structuralism. Derrida's notion that the text is everything, there's nothing but the text. And if the text is everything, then language itself has to be regarded as material or materiality in the sense of it having, some real worldly efficacy as such. And then language is potentially a prison house, as Frederick Jameson referred to it, or it becomes a potential weapon of oppression, and so on and so forth. So I just wondered if you've ever thought about that connection to post-structuralism or deconstruction.
Well, so what I say is those are other examples of my basic claim, that this is happening in a context in which people argue about the logos as effective, and certainly many of the theorists like Derrida who have made these quite slashy arguments in the last generation or so.
Yeah.
As a medievalist, it's kind of amusing because they're actually many of them were trained as medievalists to start with.
Yeah.
For example, Roland Barthes, who's famous for his arguments about polysemy and the multiplicity of interpretations, was deeply influenced by reading Henri de Lubac's medieval exegesis. And the primary claim in de Lubac is to recover what he called the four senses of Scripture, and in fact the polysemy of text that the medieval commentators saw. So what I tend to hear when I hear Derrida arguing in those terms is again the same deep Christian roots. They've given it different labels, and so people think that they're talking about something that's not theological. But Derrida in his later years became quite interested in thinking more about the religious basis of his own arguments as well.
That's interesting. Let me ask you this then, though. If they're right that language has had this performative element, throughout the Judeo-Christian tradition at least, why are they wrong? Why are they heretics?
Well, they're not, in my version, come from the religious perspective. They don't understand the theological importance of what they're suggesting. They're taking the abstraction word creates, and making it simply a human experience. And in a theological understanding, you're always in tension with the divine element there, and it's indeed the divine word that creates, not ours.
I see. So it's not. So the problem and the heresy there is that it seeds language strictly in a sort of profane way.
Yes.
It's the profane. Language is only a profane act. It doesn't. It totally divorces itself from the the sacred aspect of language and its function as a productive force for good, in effect.
Yes.
For fact, the only good, right?
Right. I mean, the greatest, the secularism question, the greatest modern heresies are focusing completely on ourselves, which brings me to the third of my unholy trinity, which was the identity politics.
Yes.
And that one, I recommend your listeners to go read the piece because it's a little complicated. I'll try to summarize it.
Yeah, give them the title again for the benefit of the readers or listeners.
Yes. So identity politics are I think at root, and I get this a lot from reading Roger Scruton's discussion of the origins of this philosophical tradition. They're at root really Marxist in the sense that they're looking for a particular consciousness of the group, and you think Marx was very interested in the self-consciousness of the class.
That's right.
The bourgeoisie or the proletariat. Modern, more recent theorists take that concept of class consciousness and apply it to other groups like women or people of color, gays, right? And as I think you and I both experienced this identity politics, it's terribly threatening when one of us who should belong to one of those groups, me as a woman, I should be a feminist,
right?
The capital F version of things. Step outside of that consciousness, because the consciousness of that group is the only thing that sustains the existence of the group.
Yes, isn't that so essentialist at base? These people that claim to be anti-essentialist and constructivists all the way through are so essentialist because, as I've said elsewhere, they assume, or rather what they do is they conflate identity with thought processes, with personality, with expression, with the content of one's speech, as opposed, in other words, they what one is saying is merely what one is. In effect, there's no content outside of identity itself, and they also consign people to categories from which they really can't escape, because they're supposed to have a certain consciousness based on their identification group, right?
Yes, and to understand that the sort of I'm, as a medievalist, always inclined to be looking for these image structures that people are thinking through. So the image structure there is the Marxist idea that the class needs to become conscious of itself.
Sure. Right.
Well, of course, that wasn't Marx's own idea.
Feuerbach,
that he gets it from Feuerbach,
Ludwig
Feuerbach's studies, and particularly Feuerbach's Essence of Christianity, where Feuerbach makes that kind of self-consciousness the primary criteria for understanding ourselves as human beings. And Feuerbach is worrying about discovering the essence of religion, and sets up this premise at the very beginning of the book saying human beings are different from animals.
Yes.
Then you start realizing what the sort of category problems are becoming. Human beings are different from animals because we have a sense of ourselves as a species.
Species being, yes. Yeah, consciousness.
We actually can
being.
understand ourselves as human beings, as a species. And everything that Feuerbach says from there is dependent on this idea of species consciousness.
Right.
So you can say, if you don't have consciousness of yourself as human, are you human at all? Because he sort of set you up
that
to say...
That becomes the criteria for being human.
That's our prime criteria that differentiates us from the beasts, the brutes.
It's interesting because this identity politics in terms of, consciousness also goes to epistemology, and it really was derived again from Marxism. The George Lukács, the Soviet... early Soviet philosopher and literary critic, suggested that the working class had this particular standpoint from which they could understand objective truth that other classes did not have, and that he called this standpoint epistemology. Of course, this was picked up by feminism, by Sandra Harding, and she called it the feminist standpoint epistemology, in which only women had this particular standpoint from which they could better grasp objective reality. And then went from there to a total relativism in which everybody has their own standpoint and nobody can understand the standpoint of another, and that person has their own truth and nobody has a singular truth. There is no such thing as a singular truth. So it becomes this mass of relativistic standpoints with nowhere. So I always say to these people, well, why are we talking? Because you have a different standpoint. I can't possibly appreciate it. We can't. There's no point in speaking to you. Goodbye.
Well, and again, this demonstrates it as a heresy.
Yeah.
That what Feuerbach, what I teach this text in my History of European Civilization class, and this is what I'm trying to get the students to the point of realizing that even Feuerbach, he sounds like he's talking in this completely secular, although he thinks he's being truly religious, but completely secular way of thinking that you start with human beings, they see themselves as a species, and then he takes that idea and says, and they project everything that they value of themselves, ideas of justice, ideas of mercy, ideas of compassion, onto this artifact, God, that they invent. Right. And then there's this wonderful way in which they forget that they've created the artifact.
Yes.
And then God acts back on human beings.
God's a projection of human consciousness. God's a projection of our so-called best values onto another exterior being in the sky or wherever. Yeah. Right.
And I first encountered this through Elaine Scarry's Body and Pain, which I've used a lot. I really like her discussion of our making. But recognize that, I mean, even she's very much an atheist in her description. But you're talking about making. Mm-hmm. The primary thing that Christianity claims is that God's the maker.
Yes.
Right. And so the claim of we as human beings in our species consciousness project our good qualities onto this artifact who then makes us is already within a Christian claim.
Oh, sure.
Right? You're already defining the divinity to start with as a made thing or a maker. Mm-hmm. And you realize you are still within the Christian
You're within that Christian paradigm, although it's a complete inversion, right?
It's an inversion, but it's still a Christian paradigm,
yeah,
right?
Sure.
It's
absolutely.
And then you realize it's utterly within the Christian paradigm, because in the Christian paradigm, the claim is human beings are made in the image and likeness of the Maker. So Feuerbach doesn't have to step very far away to say we are a reflection of God.
Right.
I mean, he's done fine. We've done that, and we're arguing about whether we did it or God did it. But you're still arguing from within that same.
Yeah, I mean, this is a common problem within secularism studies or secularist studies. Is this question of, is there any secular without the religious? And of course, there are those hardcore. I call them hard secularists, and of course, the most vulgar representation thereof are the new atheists. Who suggest, that the secular is not dependent upon the religious, that there is a separate sphere of secularity that's independent and that has its own substance. I don't know. I think it's an open question. I've never found a way out. That doesn't.
There isn't one. Can I give you my answer there?
Yeah, that's what I want. Your answer.
The secular is another of these Christian structures.
Right.
And the way I introduce that for my students in the same course, the Eurociv, is we start with Augustine. And you recognize the idea of the secular is the idea of the saeculum.
Time,
this age.
Eternity. Yeah, age.
Right. And it's a structure that presumes there's the sacred, the heavenly, and the earthly, the secular. And Christianity Judaism also plays off heaven and earth in this way, but Christianity, of course, intensifies it with things like Jesus saying, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's." Mm-hmm. That there's a proper realm of the worldly that's not identical with the kingdom of heaven,
right?
And that tension runs throughout Christian history.
Sure.
It's a major debate in the Middle Ages. It's a major debate in the Reformation. It's a major debate for us now. That we in the West think in terms of the secular is because we're still thinking within a Christian structure. Right. And this is where I say it becomes very, very important for those of us who assume Western structures when we're arguing with people from other traditions, for example, Islam.
Yeah.
They don't think in that dichotomy.
Right.
And so to argue that there should be something as the secular, it's like, how? As far as they're concerned,
they don't see that.
There can't be.
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, as you said, the first meaning of secular has to do with its distinction from the eternal, and it's about the ages. Then it becomes another way that it's used within Christianity is, of course, its reference to the clergy that were not monastic, the secular
Mm-hmm.
clergy. So, yeah, the secular is a deeply religious concept.
Yes. And that is what I said to my colleagues who responded to my Sightings piece, and they got even more upset because they say, but particularly one of my colleagues who's in my department in history, and she wrote back to me and said, I think that there needs to be a firewall between thinking religiously and thinking about the secular. And I wrote back to her and said, well, we can't, there's no, even your concept of secular.
Yeah, the firewall is religious. Hello.
The firewall is, God, Christians put the firewall there to start with, saying that there's a distinction between worship and the state.
And even in Britain, when secular education arose toward the the latter part of the 19th century, it was really not in order to create education that was devoid of religion. It was a way of solving the internecine squabbling between different sects of Protestantism. So, it wasn't erected as anti-religion. And I've tried to point this out with my scholarship on George Holyoake, the founder of what was first called secularism in the 19th century in 1851, and it was not an anti-religious atheist movement.
Right.
It was actually a pluralism.
And there you agree with the work that I used in the Sightings piece, Steve Protero's book on religious literacy in America. Have you read that one?
No, I have not read that book.
So he makes a similar argument for what happened in the American college system, that it's the Protestant denominations who sort of give up trying to fight each other and come to this gentleman's agreement to say, okay, we're not going to make confessional claims in the university context. Right.
So what do you think
and that's exactly what I quoted in my Sightings piece, and that interestingly, my colleagues resisted that as well. I mean, I had in abbreviated form my argument about multiculturalism and identity, but there was the larger argument saying, the universities have been through this, and what I recognize now in sort of following on their responses to me is maybe universities aren't very good places for having this kind of difference, because in fact we get very uncomfortable when we don't know what grounds to argue off of, and I think I understand the colleagues who want to keep that sort of secular as this thing that I don't touch. Of course, what I'm coming in and saying is, try on a religious perspective of a different sort and see how your perspective looks when you do that, and that is very unsettling.
That's exactly how I teach. Let me just say this. I want to ask you something. I'm going to tell you what my idea is, and I want to see what you think about it. We're going to work as scholars together on the spot. Okay?
Good.
I'm writing this book on the genealogy of social justice morals. Now, of course, you have just deepened that quite a bit by, I've just gotten to know your work recently, and I'm very intrigued.
Thank you.
I think it's indispensable stuff. The social justice ideology or morals. I'm arguing, as you said, is social justice ideology is a religious creed. Now, what do? It's not only a religious creed; it's now the official religious creed of the university across the country. Don't you think? It's basically
yes. It's their default now.
Yeah.
And it's very hard. It's just as hard for them to have that challenged as it was for the Anglicans to have the 39 Articles.
So we're not going to be able to drive it out of existence, and nor do I think we should try. As a matter of fact, I think we should accept it as any other creed. But if we're not going to have confessional universities, then we can't have social justice ruling the roost in the university either. So what do we do? My answer
what do we do?
Yeah, my answer is
my dog is barking now. Do you hear her?
Yes, I do.
Let me close the doors.
Okay, fine.
She stayed very quiet for very long.
She's doing well. My answer, let me tell you my answer, and I want to hear what you think about it.
Okay.
My answer is that we need a post-secular university, and that is to say, not a hardcore secularism that tries to eradicate religion. Post-secularism, I'm sure you're very familiar with the term, is a kind of acknowledgement of the persistence and the even in some cases the resurgence of religion and its deep roots in the culture, where it's actually, as you see it, as the foundation of culture, that it's not going away. Therefore, we need a kind of supersession of the various religious sects and creeds, and relegating social justice to just one of them, rather than allowing, first it has to be recognized as a creed, as a religious creed, and then not allowing it to run the university, because we have other belief systems, don't we, that still should be considered, and that should not be considered anathema to our thinking. For example, Christianity, or any other creed for that matter. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think we're never going to get out of it's always going to be a religious question. So
I think the post-secular tries to get to that idea that it's never really secular; it's a post-secularity.
So I think I sent you this one too. I did a post on John Locke and his letter on toleration, and recognizing that in order to have the kind of disagreements that you're suggesting that we try to have, I'm not sure what other structure we have other than the Christian to do it in, which is problematic, because Christianity posits the things that Locke hinges his idea of toleration on. That one, there's a separation between the state and the commonwealth and practices of worship. Two, therefore, that the state or the commonwealth exists in order to keep, do things like protect people's property, but also protect their liberty.
Right.
And that within that structure, you don't tell people how to worship.
Okay. So if you were to say, if one were to acknowledge that the secular is a deeply religious concept,
right,
would you be comfortable with the idea of a post-secular university that acknowledges the religiosity of all these creeds?
Well, that's what we've been trying in religious studies for the last 100 years, and
it's not working.
One of the difficult things that the religious studies people found out, which I'm actually more in history than religious studies, but I have conversations that deal with some of this problem. It's very difficult to define religion
Sure.
outside of the original meaning of the word in Latin, which meant worship.
Religion,
right? And in religious studies, there were all sorts of difficulties from the late 19th century saying, well, what counts as religion or worship? What counts as, is Confucianism a religion or a philosophy?
Right.
So you and I you will say things like the secular leftism now is a religion, and let's say we're not worshiping anything.
Yeah, right.
Well, I say, yes, you are. You're worshiping diversity, and you're worshiping
they are.
a particular self-consciousness.
They have creeds that are inviolable and so on and so forth. So, it's religious, no matter what they say. It is.
But I say it's always unfortunate. I know there's a Jewish element in this too that's important to keep focus on, but I don't know what other option we have for toleration other than the one that Locke set up. And in the end of that post, I talk about how, well, if you have a religious philosophy like Marxism in its strong form that claims that the state is comprehensive, well, and there should be no religion, then that doesn't seem to be a terrifically good solution. Neither do I think most Westerners want the solution of Sharia, which would be the church is the state, and the two are...
You take it from feminists who seem to be cuddling up with, Islamism. It seems quite...
Well, I think they haven't thought through the theological implications of their because what they're doing, the feminists are supporting the Muslim women within an appreciation of cultural diversity.
Right.
Which, as we talked about, has other entailments.
Cultural relativism. Let's put it this way: absolute cultural relativism
it can't work.
It doesn't work.
And that's why I say I think we're seeing the terrible anxieties that our students are experiencing on our campuses. You cannot function in a situation of utter relativism.
This kind of aporia, this absence of any sort of foundationalism at all, doesn't even provide the grounds for healthy debate of any kind.
Right. So my solution is, I like the Western tradition of toleration and the
Me too.
the
Which is,
not being forced to worship in any particular way. I think that's America got that right. We did that well. But my argument is we need to become, as scholars, more self-conscious of the actual theological positions that we're taking, including those of the atheists.
Yes.
And to be honest about that and upfront about it. So I say, I'm Christian. I can argue from this perspective. I'm aware of it sufficiently that I can take it off and argue from this other perspective to model that for you.
Yeah.
And that we as teachers practice that self-consciousness in our own modeling.
Yeah.
But that we recognize that there's no non-theological position that we can ever take. We are always situated somewhere.
Okay.
And Stanley Fish had some wonderful essays on this that I really like. And we haven't heard about him in a while, but there's when he's talking about there's no such thing as a text without context. You can't read without some kind of
So the new
frame.
critics were wrong, totally. Yeah. And so was Derrida. So let me just ask you this then. Let's move ahead a little bit in the liberal pantheon. I noticed your piece about John Stuart Mill. I read that with some keen interest because it's in my, it goes right into the heart of my work. Not that I deal with Mill that directly, but, it's the period that I study. And you had some issues with Mill and his on liberty and his notions of free speech. Let's talk about that and try to also tie it into the campus context that we're dealing with today.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell what's your problem with Mill?
Well, as I said, I have a love-hate relationship with him.
Yeah.
Although I think I'm mainly realizing why I'm uncomfortable. On the one hand, he has this image of the Middle Ages as this period when people could be individuals, which is, of course, his great. He wants people to be able to be individuals, and he feels like in the mid-19th century, people are the society has become tyrannical, which I suspect society always has been, but even more so with mass society, and even more so with that mass society that could be swayed by things like newspapers, which all felt very topical, right?
Social tyranny, yes, right.
There was some irony in that piece as I was going through, saying it's always been hard to teach Mill, again in my Eurociv class, because it feels like you're just teaching orthodoxy, which of course was my joke.
It seems so self-evident today, right? It's like trying to discuss air because it's the thing that's around you at all times. So it's hard to actually see it.
Right, and so there's great things that he says, like that in order to truly know something, you have to have debated it properly. And in creeds that people haven't had to test against their best opponents are not properly understood. So if you have any kind of doctrine that you have not had to test against a real opponent, you're not going to understand it yourself properly. And Milo says this regularly. Like we don't actually want our opponents in any of these conversations to be weak. We want them to bring their best arguments to us. And Milo, I felt, has in the university context been very important because he tries to model that. If people come and yell things at him and just insult him, he'll yell back. Yeah. But if they actually ask him a good question, he will answer it and try to argue it. So you say that's good. That's Mill's model of debate. But of course, the more you read Mill, the more sort of confusing it gets. It's like, well, but on the other hand, he does think that the debate's going to end eventually.
Yes, I see.
There will be solutions.
Right.
He has that very interesting place where he basically ends up saying Christians are selfish, which because they all they worry about is the afterlife, and they don't really care about society. And so the pagans were more virtuous than the Christians.
It's a very, very superficial understanding of Christianity, obviously, but
right. And that he has that interesting place where he basically says, if Europe can't defend itself as a civilization, better to give it over to the barbarians, and have them take over, which I thought was kind of weirdly topical. But of course, not recognizing the barbarians that took over when he's imagining were Christian. So there are ways in which he has become our orthodoxy, but I think there are pitfalls in what became our orthodoxy, including the non-recognition, as we've been talking about, the role that Christianity played in creating some of the things that he actually values, including dispute.
Yes.
And the desire to debate properly,
and also the contradiction that he seems to posit, in the idea that we need eccentrics, we need eccentricity,
yes,
we need to have people that will constantly be problematic for the hashtag problematic for the
dangerous. We need to be dangerous.
We need dangerous faggots,
We do.
so on and so forth. But at the same time, or in the next breath, almost. Eventually, we're going to come to consensus, and there'll be, indisputable truths.
Right.
So, I don't know. That seems difficult to square those two things. I don't see where that's going to happen, nor do I think it's a good thing if it did. I don't want ideological uniformity. I don't know. Do you?
The thing is, I think he's absolutely right that ideas that are not tested are held. When anybody says blind faith, which I think is not a thing, but they mean that, right? That you haven't actually examined your ground, and things that are not properly examined are held badly. So I think there he's right, but he is disingenuous when he wants the eccentrics and he thinks they're important. But he really would prefer the society that basically agreed with his sense of what's right, and I think that that one was one of my. I did a series on free speech for Milo's readers, and that one included things on Milton and the Bills of Rights and
back to the free
Milo
speech.
himself.
Yeah.
But I think with Mill, it's interesting. We think of Mill as the ground of our arguments about free speech, but it's already conflicted in his and on liberty, how that's going to play out. And I think in that sense, writing that piece on Mill made me see much of what he discusses there is still implicit in basic liberal arguments, including its discomfort with Christian teachings.
Oh yes, it's there. It's definitely there. But what then do you have? You seem to sort of scoff at free speech fundamentalism, if you will. What is your sense about what the state of academic freedom, free speech on campus? Where do you think we are, and what do you think where should we go from here?
So I think we should all be fencers.
Okay. Yeah.
That there's a lot. Fencing was actually sort of practice for people for a while, and modeling this kind of debate that we should be in.
Yes. And
my blog is Fencing Bear at Prayer, and a lot of what I started the blog to explore the kind of psychological effects of training as a fencer, and one of them is you have to learn that you need an opponent. It's not about winning. Well, it is, right? It's competitive, but it's about drawing out the best in yourself.
Yes.
And you cannot do that without a strong opponent. This again, going back to the debate culture that Milo and I think are more comfortable with maybe than some of our colleagues.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So that does bring us to safe spaces then, and that whole notion.
Yes.
If we are.
Well, I have an idea about that too.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Right?
Continue.
So,
yeah.
The classroom should be a safe space in the sense of it's the space where you have these competitions, right?
Yes.
It's a safe space like a fencing strip, right? There are rules of engagement, and certainly there are rules of playing the game properly, right? You can't have a conversation in class without people having done the reading, listening to each other, being respectful in the proper sense of hearing each other and making sure you pay attention. But it's safe so that dangerous things can happen. That like fencing is, you're going to get bruised, you're going to lose, and you're going to
intellectual things.
I get hit by real things, right? Not words.
Yeah.
And learning to deal in your own psyche with that kind of interaction takes a lot of practice. And what I see in the students that are ending up screaming at talks and refusing to listen is people who have not practiced being contradicted and have not practiced having to say, okay, so I know I have this argument and I know it's right, but I haven't made it in the best form I could, and so this person I'm talking to is not persuaded. And that's what our classroom should be. The model of disputatio, the medieval disputation, is you come in prepared to joust.
Indeed.
And so, and it's both an emotional training and a level of skill that you need to practice. And I did a post on that one called "Some Advice to Trigglypuff."
Yeah.
And her teachers, the girl who was at Amherst,
I know Trigglypuff.
Yelling.
Right.
And the first is train your emotions, and the second is develop real skills. And that's, I think, what we need to go back to in our classroom thinking. It's that kind of competitive environment that requires a certain sort of
rigor and disputation and rhetorical finesse and training, rhetorical vigor as well. Yeah, and
yes.
where students are being protected from, and thus they're not being developed
right.
as good interlocutors for their views. And so instead of doing that, they turn their backs and scream.
Mm-hmm.
Which is really strange, and it's quite contradictory, because that seems hardly to be a safe space. At least for those who are being screamed at, it's not very safe.
Well, it's not a safe space for anybody, because it means that nobody is able to practice anything. It's just temper tantrums.
Yeah.
And Fencing Bear, the bear is 13 now, in the sense I've been fencing for 13 years, and you find yourself feeling like a toddler a lot at the beginning of certain practices, that you don't know what you're doing isn't working. It's frustrating. You, particularly as an adult, you think, oh, I should be able to do this.
Yeah.
There's as someone who studies monasticism, spiritual discipline is a real thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say culturally that's the thing we're most lacking in, is a kind of training in, Mill's right there, training in virtue. He's wrong. The Christians have it, and I think they have it better than the pagans that he's admiring. But
you're talking to a former seminarian. I was a seminarian in high school.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
So you need that training in order to deal with the intellectual stress.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to be more conscious of doing both, rather than just saying we're going to protect people from these things that make them frightened. They should make them frightened, and we need to give them better tools for thinking through why that happens.
But isn't their position, in effect, the consequence of that Millian belief that we will reach consensus, and they think we have or should have by now? That's the problem. That there's no way that these views are controvertible in any, or possibly controvertible at all.
Yeah, there I don't know what to do, because A, I think they're wrong, and B, they clearly don't want to listen to me or you. It sounds like, when we say, well, whichever position I'm coming from, I think this social discussion is not finished. I don't think we've considered the full implications of the way in which we're encouraging people to behave, and there's problems still. And they're saying, no, there's not. You should shut up because you're hateful.
Right. Or you're a woman. You're a privileged woman. You're a white woman. You're a cis male. You're a cis woman. You're, the whole 9 yards. It all goes back to your privileged status.
Right.
In the end, for them, that's the way they reduce it if you don't say the right things.
But these are arguments of morality.
Yes.
And not being able to discuss moral issues calmly. Well, moral issues are always going to be most emotional.
Yes. Is there anything I haven't talked about that you want to say or bring up that you'd like to get across?
So very back at the beginning, you were asking me about the packet and the responses.
Yes.
Bringing it in with my sense of being a fencer. I did another long post. You realize all this has happened on the blog, right? The blog has been a great venue.
I'll put up
for
a link
me
to that blog too for the.
Thank you.
Yep.
That I did a full response to that packet called 7 in 1 Blow, because I was answering all 7, and I was also being the giant killer.
Yes.
And one thing I wanted to make sure that people understood is, well, those people wrote something and published it under their own name and gave me the possibility of responding. That I did have colleagues who didn't do that, right? They just talked about me behind my back.
Yeah, I know that. That approach.
I have much more respect for the people who wrote something, put it on their own name, and let me respond properly. then I know there have been people around that I blogged about some of that because I also had friends who showed me things that they'd written.
Mm-hmm.
What we need is to be, sort of calm enough in our own practice to be able to talk about these things openly with each other. And so I'm not actually angry with any of the people that wrote in the packet. I'm sorry about some of the ways that they, as you say, they completely did not understand my argument.
I don't think they did
at all.
No.
And I tried to explain in my response why, but at least the first one, the graduate student, Emily Cruz, acknowledged that these were things worth talking about. So I'm like, she doesn't get a point against me, but she doesn't. I said simultaneous attack, right?
But there was one. I don't know if it was hers or another one, the second one that said something to the effect that, well, these things haven't gone away, as if they, like these views that you've expressed. Like they haven't gone away, or and the phrase that's used for that is you're on the wrong side of history, or this is 2017, and
that I disagree with.
Yeah.
I did my one departmental colleague, Amy Stanley, who she didn't get any points. I didn't even let her play effectively because she said, "Well, there's nothing to debate here. All of Rachel's ideas are odious and not even worthy of consideration." I'm like, well, that's a non-starter.
Yeah, that's for
sure. Let's talk about it rather than shutting it all down.
Now, on campus,
I still, I don't think there's.
Go ahead.
I think I'm right. I still think I'm right, but I do recognize that I need to come up with better ways of making my arguments if they're not persuaded.
Yeah. Well, how just to bring it into a slightly professional / personal level. How does it feel being on campus? Do you feel like a pariah at all on campus, or are you shunned at all? Do you feel any kind of ostracization at all?
So when I was writing the blog post this winter, autumn and winter, I was on leave on sabbatical.
That's good, convenient, yeah.
So when the Sightings piece came out, I'd been on campus for meetings, but I hadn't been there regularly for teaching. This week is the spring term, and I just started back teaching. I made a joke about why, how famous I am to my first class, just to let them defuse a little bit, say, laugh at it. It's funny.
Yes, I did the same thing.
The students are fine. They're they understand that we're here to learn. The colleagues I've run into, and this is Milo he's been a great friend and advisor for me over these last several months. I asking him, sort of, how do I survive this, right?
Yeah.
Get through this.
Question.
And what he said was, and this is the best advice anybody's ever given me, remember to laugh, right?
That's
and
great.
Whenever I see it takes energy for me because I'm actually an introvert. But if I see someone, I go in, and I try to come up with some kind of disarming, gee, I've made him, haven't I been mischievous, right? And that actually helps.
People a little bit. I've had a little bit of that, but it's not quite so easy in my case because I have about 90 colleagues, and I'd say 87 totally shun me.
Well, so I heard, I saw that, and I was very sorry to read that.
Yeah.
I think some of it helps that I'm at the University of Chicago because we actually, our administration keeps saying,
I hear that,
we're a place where you have this kind of conversation. Right after my Sightings piece came out, and then Milo was banned from CPAC and lost his book contract and lost his job and everything. That same week, our president, Robert Zimmer, published another of his pieces with the Wall Street Journal saying, yes, we would have, even Richard Spencer come to, and now my colleagues and the students are upset about that, but University of Chicago has been a place where we've really been pushing this problem fairly, and I think that shows how important the administration's position is in defending this kind of openness, that without the administration's support, the climate on campus would be very, very different. And I think my colleagues, Amy and I, for example, have been in the department together for 22 years. These are not people that don't know me. Although sometimes they were responding as if they didn't know me. Yeah. I was like, that's silly, right? Remember who I am.
They didn't know the evil that lurked within you.
Yes, they did. they did, right? I've been
That's how
quite
it
open.
comes off for me, is they didn't know the evil that lurked within all this time.
Well, and I think that when people are surprised, that's when they're worst, right? When you quite literally catch them off guard and suddenly they have to recategorize you.
Yes.
That's frightening for them. And if I'm a woman and they expect me to be more feminist and they have to recategorize me, that makes them very anxious.
Yeah,
and,
sure. Well, it's been great talking to you. I think we'll kind of wrap it up unless you have anything else you'd like to say. Is there any other...
Thank you.
You're quite welcome. It's great talking to you. I think this is a generative conversation. It's the kind of conversations that should be going on in the university that aren't, because we have a set doctrine that we have to, accede to in advance and so on and so forth. But this has been great, and I'll put up those links. If there's any other links you have, send them to me, and I'll put them up with the YouTube video.
Thank you.
Okay, great talking
to you,
to
Michael.
you. Take care, Rachel. Bye-bye.
Bye.